So the story was 1985, I was working at the Financial Post, and my editor thought it would be kind of fun, I think is the way he put it, to make a girl the mining reporter. And I thought, boy, that's a challenge. So he threw that down and I took it up, and more than 25 years later, I was on a 12-hour march to a mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo through, occupied territories, and it was a little unnerving, but it was fantastic. So that's a little bit of my trajectory, and a lot of that time spent in business journalism, so I have a bit of perspective on this. So the question, have we achieved equity? I think we've pretty much answered that. Yeah. So let's explore more deeply where we haven't. Mary Lou, I'm going to start with you. So I read a report this week that in the United Kingdom they're recommending that executive bonuses be tied to achieving gender balance targets. And when I say that, you have to understand that Prime Minister David Cameron is in fact going to be hosting a summit for finance leaders at Downing Street. So this is serious business. It's very much high level. But I guess the question becomes, how do you increase the number of women in senior finance roles? That's what that initiative is going to consider. How far do we go to force change? You mentioned that at KPMG there are quotas, I think you said, did you not? Goals. And so the question for you is, how far do we push to make it happen? And Justin Trudeau, of course, has done something along these lines.
Right. So I think it comes back to KPMG looking at internally at our processes and policies and where are the biases within those processes and how do we recognize them and deal with them. So how far do we push? I don't think it's very Canadian, to be honest, to say that we're going to make it 40% or whatever is the right number. I don't even know what the right number would be. I think the goal is to make sure that women are available in the pipeline, getting the opportunities, and then winning it for themselves. To actually say, I don't think any woman in the room wants a job because she's a woman. I think they want a fair playing field, and I think they want the opportunities, and I think that's where we have to fix the policies and processes around that.
Okay. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this? I mean, there's some people who would argue, well, if you don't push, it's not going to happen. There was a report out from the Canadian Securities Administrators recently on 700 publicly traded Canadian companies. Half of those had not one woman on the board. And that made me think I'm still back in 1985. Any thoughts?
Leaf actually made a submission to both the Ontario Securities Commission and the Canadian Securities Regulators on improving this situation, and there's some really straightforward things that can be done that, when people are allergic to the idea of quotas, well, just do some really basic stuff like advertise your board positions when they come up, right? Just have more openness and transparency about how you go about finding the people that you put in the pipeline. And of course, mentorship programs are so important. It looks as though KPMG is very much engaged in creating an environment where mentorship is just something that simply happens in the workplace, and it needs to. Because as we noted in your presentation, I think self-esteem has often been an issue. And there is, if you have a mentor, building your self-esteem and saying, actually you can do this, and putting you forward. But the comply and explain stuff is really a very good way to go about it. Is, if you're not complying with the goals that are in place, then tell us why that's happening.
But isn't it the case that a lot of companies, you're talking about the OSC business now, isn't it the case that a lot of companies are simply saying, no, we're going to take a pass on that?
I think that's probably right, yeah.
Well, any thoughts, Amanda? Like the notion, is mentoring, mentoring is fantastic when you're in the right organization, right?
Well, it was interesting because with Ad Women of Toronto, which we started, I should have said we started it 10 years ago. And when we started it 10 years ago, mentorship was a key component, a key pillar of it. And what we found as we grew the organization 10 years later, that more women were telling us that one-on-one mentorship was not working for them. That they wanted group and network opportunities more than they wanted the one-on-one. That they felt that network, well, they felt, like I said in the presentation, that network breeds opportunity. Mm-hmm. The more people you know, the more you share. It's why that kind of digital piece that I talked about became so important. but they really felt that when they had the opportunity to be in a room full of people, men and women, there was then the opportunity to get to know what could exist for them, as opposed to putting all your eggs in one basket and hoping that this person can usher your way through your career. I thought that was a really valuable insight that we received from younger women who are coming into the industry, and I think most of them have felt the feedback that we've received is that as we've moved to a more group-led model, the opportunities have opened for them. The doors have opened.
Prior to the naming of the cabinet, there was,
Yeah.
of course, a lot of talk about merit versus,
Yeah.
I'll use the word quotas. Does anybody want to speak to the issue of sort of the backlash against that, or make an argument against why the presentation of merit should supersede the issue of gender?
I think it's embarrassing in 2015 that it was even talked about before the election, because, I mean, there are fabulous women that are MPs, and I didn't get it at all. And that comes back to the whole convincing that we do need the business case, because people don't get it. And so I don't think we're there yet.
I mean, I guess I would just question the assumption that all of the male cabinet ministers we've had over the last, say, 10 years have been qualified for that job.
You're not
I
thinking
mean,
Julian Fantino, are you?
But seriously, I do think, when we talk about what pool it is that you're drawing from, how could we possibly believe that we're getting the most qualified candidates when we're not drawing from the entirety of the pool?
Exactly.
And so just back to this question about quotas, I mean, to me, I am learning about recruitment in the job that I'm in here for the hospital, and one of the things that I have found really valuable to think about is not to have a requirement about the kind of candidate that I'm going to hire, but to have a requirement about the slate of options I'm going to present to a search committee. And so I am very committed and have become increasingly committed to the notion that the committee is going to pick the right candidate that you put in front of them, but your job as a recruiter is to give them a diverse slate from which to choose, because often those diverse candidates are going to surprise you.
Right.
They're going to turn out to be amazing, but you're going to have to push yourself to look a little harder and in some less of the more traditional locations in order to find them. And so I'm not sure that I would shy away from the notion of a quota. But I think that there are creative things that we can be doing with quotas, including ensuring that the pool from which you're drawing is a sufficiently diverse pool that you're more likely to pull out those more diverse candidates.
Yeah.
I would agree with the slate being a quota, just not the appointment being a quota.
I would also just add that,
Yeah.
there's such an important aspect as well in having role models. So now all these young women in the country will see that there are all these amazing women who have been elected, who are in cabinet, who have leadership roles, because we've known for decades that really the issue for women's representation in politics, which is nudging up by a tiny amount every year in terms of the overall number of women elected, the problem is at the nomination stage. It's women getting the initial nomination, right, to run in the first place. So we need more women who are willing to put their names forward, but we also need support at that stage. To get that slate that everybody wants, you really have to put in that front end work. But in order to get there, we need to see women in the roles doing the job, doing a great job. And I think it has a knockdown effect.
I agree. Am I allowed to agree? The name Sheryl Sandberg. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. You agreed. Go.
The name Sheryl Sandberg came up, or at least the concept of lean in came up. And if I understand it correctly, that concept is essentially women need to literally lean in more, present themselves more, be in the face more of, advocate for themselves more, and all of this. And that came in. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg being the COO of Facebook. And so, that came in for both adulation and criticism. Where are we on that? Mary Lou, do you want to pick up on that one?
So as I mentioned, I think it was a very valuable book to a point. And I think that we had a lot of learnings from that. I was actually at a event the other night, and a woman came up to me and asked me, she was thinking about going on this board, and she wasn't sure if they're financially stable, and should she do it? And I go, you're thinking like a girl. And then next thing I see, appointment, she took the board. But sometimes we do. But I don't think that's it. That's not where it stops. I think that the corporations, business world, medical world, everything else has to change to meet them halfway.
Interesting that you should say that, because I think one of the things that we wanted to talk about here was to really drill into sector by sector to understand more completely what individual sectors can do, and then go beyond that. So maybe, Amanda, you'll pick up there in terms of your, as you said in your presentation, there you are now with this fantastic group of women in an industry that was very much, having reported on it, I can say, very much, you know, an old man's, not an old man's, but do you know what I mean? It's
An old boys club.
an old boys network, very much. So, and yet I think we have to be hesitant to think the world is our oyster, right? And maybe that's true in some industries, and certainly for people who are adept at social media and et cetera. But where do you feel the obstacles still are? You used a photograph, I think, up there of the chief creative officer, I think it was at Saatchi & Saatchi. So that must be a breakthrough moment, just as Katie Taylor at RBC, that's a breakthrough moment. So we still have to mark those. I think it's important still to mark those.
Yep.
What's the work that's yet to be done?
Yeah, I mean, for the first time last year, we had a woman creative officer who went to Cannes, was one of the judges. This was a big deal. This was celebrated, and actually, I think there was a comment made earlier about why we have to celebrate the Katie Taylors on the front of the Globe and Mail, and I actually think we do need to celebrate. I disagree with that. I think that we need to celebrate it because it's the same reason why we need to celebrate having gender parity in cabinet, because we have to inspire younger women to know that it's a possibility, to believe that they can get there. And I think until we celebrate it and make it the norm, it becomes a little bit of a closed door phenomenon. I think we talk about it outwardly and then we do other things behind closed doors, and that's why we have 17% of board seats being held by women. That's why we have 5% in those CEO positions. And if I can just take one more second. On quotas, I didn't say this, I do think that there's merit to quotas. And the reason why is because we can celebrate cabinet parity. We can all talk about it. We can all even throw our hands in the air and say, well, of course, because it's 2015. But we're not prepared to say the same thing about corporate boardroom tables. Why is that? Arguably, this is the most important boardroom table in the country, and we want to see 50% parity there, but we're going to dilute it and walk it back a little bit when we talk about other industries. It's 2015 for all industries. It's time.
Beautifully put.
Can I just comment on the Katie Taylor since we're so I think I agree we should celebrate. I think it's unfortunate that it is a celebration at this day. That was my point, right? That we still have to.
No,
I
get
do
where
think
you're
we
coming
should
from.
because I think she's a rock star as well.
Because I think, you know, we're from the same generation, and I went to school with law students and lived with them in the 70s, which was a nightmare in itself. But anyway, you know, and the topic of quotas was on the table, and we all said, no, we can't do that, because it will happen organically.
And it hasn't.
And the fact of the matter hasn't. It hasn't. One thing that didn't come up a lot, or maybe not at all, we didn't really talk about the gender gap. So Dr. Stanton, I'd like you to sort of pick up on that. You know, we've got Hillary Clinton campaigning on the wage gap. We've got the actress Jennifer Lawrence complaining. We've got Patricia Arquette at the Oscars complaining that women actresses are paid less than male actresses. And when I looked up the stats, it was when you founded Leaf, I think we were paid 35% less, and now it's something like 25% less. So
and much more for Indigenous women.
I
for
had that
racialized
point,
women.
yes,
Yeah.
completely. And counterbalancing that, well, not, you know, is the increase in precarious work and all of those negative factors in society. So what has to happen there? Because this is a brand new day. We make new policy with a new federal government. What needs to happen?
So the laws are actually there. It's illegal to pay a woman less than a man for work of the same value, and yet the practice persists. And it's not because not enough women are graduating from university, so that's not the issue. I think in part it's the need for leadership, really, really clear leadership, and that applies, you know, whether it's the wage gap, whether it's with respect to board appointments, who's promoted at what point, and so on. It really requires leadership at the top to say, this is important and we're going to get it done. And, you know, I had a really interesting experience last December. I was invited to a roundtable at Queen's Park on sexual violence. And the Premier and 6 of her ministers came into the room and talked about, with a number of us who work in the sector, violence against women sector. And I can't tell you how amazing it was to sit at a table where I didn't have to worry about whether we could say gender-based or gender mainstreaming, feminism. There was a feminist leading the table, and she and all of the ministers fell into line about what needed to be done, because she said, this is important, it needs to happen, and we're going to do something about it. And therefore, they all tried to figure out what to do and invited those of us who know what to do into the room to talk about it in real terms. And that is new. I mean, I've been working in this, as a feminist activist for 25, 30 years, and I've never before sat in a room where the person really in power was a feminist and made it clear that this was going to happen and people needed to get it done. And that is what is required in order for these things to be done. I mean, all of the other stuff has to happen too. There needs to be litigation and education and health law and policy, and all of those things need to happen. But they really won't happen until there is leadership that says this must be done, let's get it done.
Danielle, did you want to pop in? Because you've written in the Star and elsewhere about the need for a basic wage and talked a lot about precarious work.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of observations. I mean, I think one of the many extraordinary things about this new federal cabinet, and I think we're in for a treat in a whole lot of ways, but one of the things that I think is going to be interesting to observe is what will change about those public conversations, and we may even, under this government, have some insight into what changes in the private conversations as well. I have a feeling that we are going to get more of a view into how those conversations are different as a result of the fact that there are so many women around that table. And certainly in medicine, medicine is one of those few industries or professions where technically speaking it's impossible to not have equal pay for equal work, because technically speaking we still continue as a profession to mostly be paid on fee for service. So that if I, as a family doctor, take a look at you and determine that you've got diabetes or high blood pressure or whatever it is, or an equivalent male does the same task, by definition, we get paid the same amount for that particular task. And yet, wage inequity, even among very high-earning groups like physicians, persists, and it persists in a whole lot of really interesting ways, including the relativity gap between the higher earning specialties and the lower earning specialties, and which ones happen to have overrepresentation of women and which ones happen to have overrepresentation of men. And I'm involved in some research right now that's looking at women representation on provincial medical association boards. So for those who aren't hip to all of this lingo, these are essentially the organizations that bargain for doctors with government to determine the conditions of our work and our wages, among other things. And it will probably not surprise you to know that although actually more than 50% of women graduating from our medical schools in Canada, more than 50% of people graduating from our medical schools are women, and in fact in Quebec it's like 75% of graduates are women into medicine, we have not seen a shift in the gender makeup of the people who bargain the contracts for doctors. And it's not just a time lag, to Mary Lou's point. I think it was Mary Lou who said it earlier. It's not because there's a 10-year lag. You can follow as the graph goes up and up and up for graduation. It just stays rock bottom in terms of the medical association boards. And so what's hard for me to, what's impossible to imagine is the counterfactual, right? How would my work conditions as a female physician be different if a woman had been on the bargaining team 20 years ago when they started talking about maternity leave policy, which, by the way, for doctors continues to be 16 weeks in Canada, in Ontario. How would my life be different in terms of would I even still be on fee-for-service? Would I be on salary? Would I be employed by this hospital instead of an independent practitioner? Like, it's impossible to imagine how my life might be different. And the reality is that actually, in medicine, it continues to be the case that our representatives at that bargaining table don't reflect the diversity of our own profession. Never mind, groups that are much lower earned. I mean, nobody's crying in my household because of my low income, and nevertheless, that persists.
The author Anne-Marie Slaughter is going to be in town tomorrow, and she wrote this book called Unfinished Business, and some people may have seen her Atlantic piece called Women Can't Have It All, which was the most well-read piece ever produced on Atlantic magazine's website, as far as I know. And there's been a backlash against that from some quarters, saying that, so one of the things that doesn't come out in that is that, according to some authors, well, women voluntarily choose to pivot out at different points in time in their career. And that we will never have the conditions that are required to sort of achieve true, if we want to call it equity or equality. Anybody like to pick up on that? She's going to be on Anna Maria Tremonti, so we'll...
One of the things that I thought was interesting as I was putting this presentation together and talking about gender, where gender meets demographics and the millennial generation, was that we're only seeing the front half of that generation really start having families, right? Because this generation, it's really like 1980 to 2000 is the pretty agreed upon time frame. So while I spoke about it with so much hope and optimism and the future is promising and all of those things, I do think that we haven't quite reached that juncture yet where we know how family will play a role in some of the aspirations of these women. I hope not as much, but at the same time, I know, and I think probably shared by a lot of women in this room who do have families, there does come a time, I remember going on mat leave thinking, I can't wait to get back and I'm ready, and I felt like everything I did halfway. I was kind of like a halfway mom, and I was a halfway in my profession, and it was a very difficult, very frustrating time in my life, and I felt like being absent from my career was damning, that I couldn't be absent. So, and I know that that's a genuine issue that faces women. So I did, if I could have done a 45-minute presentation, that's the back half of it, is to understand, first of all, the superwoman status that we give women, that like elusive status that every woman is trying to achieve. How damaging is that? And B, how this cohort, this millennial cohort, will tackle having a family and quote unquote having it all.
So the best advice I ever got on that topic was from a mentor of mine who's an obstetrician at an unnamed hospital down the street. And I was just about to have my daughter, and she said to me, this is how you're gonna feel. You're gonna feel all the time like you're in the wrong place. Yeah. When you're at work, you're gonna wish you were at home. When you're at home, you're gonna wish you were at work. You're gonna feel like you're never fully present and you're never delivering on any of the obligations. And I said to her, if you could go back, she's a generation older than I am, I said, if you could go back and do it differently, what would you do? She had 3 kids. And I thought for sure she was gonna say, I would not take so much call, I would not miss so many ballet recitals or whatever. And she just looked at me and said, I would have just gone to therapy and let go of all that shit. Right? Like, who's doing that to us? We're doing that to ourselves,
I think
great advice.
End on that note. We've got about 10 minutes.
Quote of the year.
Definitely going to recite that advice.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. I believe there's a mic somewhere that's going to be passed about. If anybody has a question for any of our panelists. The mic is coming to you.
At least there's one.
Yeah, we don't have drone delivery of the mic.
Feminism got us part way so that we're able to at least try for those jobs and in a professional sort of capacity, but it really hasn't done the work beyond that. What happens when you become a parent? What happens when you have a family? And I certainly am coming up against this myself. I'm a single mom and trying to, keep it together and get to work every day and get to daycare and having this sort of very precarious childcare scenario where, everything has to sort of, it's all very, very tightly sort of scheduled. And one of the things that I was very jealous of, I was living in the UK for a long time, and they've introduced parental leave, which can be taken by either parent, and it's a full year, and you can split it amongst the whichever parent. And I wonder about whether or not that's something maybe this cabinet might consider, and whether or not, there's always an assumption that long maternity leave is a good thing. And I think generally it is, if you so choose, but what if the other parent wants to do that? And so I'm just interested in any comments on that?
We do actually have parental leave in Canada. Yeah. What's interesting, I mean, certainly in the law context, over 50% of the people who graduate from law school now are women. But we still have the stat that within 5 years of beginning practice, 50% of women have left practice. And there are parental leave policies at a lot of the firms, but no guy wants to be the first guy to take parental leave because he will be seen as not wanting to be on the partner track. Yeah. And so still you have the women taking the leave and jumping off of the partner track. And so there needs to, again, be a cultural shift. But there also need to be a whole bunch of other things, like a national daycare program, right? Yes. There has to be proper childcare for people so that they can, in fact, be sure that their kids are going to be cared for by caring qualified people in registered childcare spaces. And frankly, there are a lot of racialized women who are childcare providers, and they're not being paid properly to do that work. They need to be properly paid. They need to have benefits. They need to have mat leave as well. There's a whole legion of policies that could be put into place to support women so that they can make choices about their employment and about their career, and that the women who support them are not being treated badly in the process. I mean, one of the really dirty secrets of the feminist movement was that a lot of the white liberal feminists who did so well relied on care from domestic workers from overseas who had no citizenship, had no prospects of citizenship, were badly treated, were exploited for their labor, and those are things we need to fix, right? So I think there's a lot of responsibility that needs to go around on this front, but making it possible for women to have it all means putting in place programs like national daycare.
Because as you've shown, we can change the laws, and we can sort of, ensure that we have, maybe we can ensure that we have quotas. But I think if men aren't on board, it might be more challenging. So I'm wondering how we sort of advance that, especially in light of, recent events where we've seen sort of people coming forward and there's been threats against feminists and things like that. So I think it's kind of timely.
I think one thing that goes on, Catalyst has a going across the country men talking to men. So our CEO, Bill Thomas, is also part of that. And it is putting the men on the panel. And in order to get in, you wouldn't have an audience like this. To get in, you have to bring a man with you. So it is trying to get to the conversation, and hearing from senior leadership talk sincerely about it does make a difference. But I do wonder, maybe it's back to the earlier comment about the young folks coming in. Do you think that's changing? Do you think that the new 25 to 35-year-old men have a different attitude than the 55 to 65-year-old men?
Well, it's interesting. I used to think that until recently, when we've seen a lot of this anti-feminist rhetoric coming out of, and I was shocked. I thought that it would be a different demographic, but it's actually propagated a lot by my own age group. And so that was really concerning for me, because I thought that we were making strides, and that young men were sort of in the fight with us. And so it was very concerning to me to find out that the people who were propagating that were often sort of from a younger demographic. I don't know that we're outgrowing it, and I don't know what the source of it is. But
I think we find it within our firm, because we do have about 3 generations in the firm at one point in time, that maybe not around the feminist attitude, but there's a lot more the younger fathers that want the balanced life, whatever that's called, however you make that work. So the conversations are quite different than they would have been 30 years ago. So, but I don't know your particular point at all, to be honest. But I just thought I would make that point.
no, I'm glad to hear.
I think we've been talking here about kind of 2 streams in this conversation about equity for women, and one is about the kind of boardroom CEO, and the other is the story of the deaf woman in labor who couldn't get services, or women who can't, or violence against women, or women who can't afford to pay for the medications they need to treat their diseases. And I think, Kim, you mentioned that how different it was to sit at the table where there's the leader who is the woman and getting everybody in line to then address those issues of that other piece of equity. And I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more from all of you, since I think we have focused a lot on the kind of career accomplishments of high-level women, how you think that improving equity in leadership roles for women really will end up having impact for women across the board, across our populations who are dealing with inequities or lack of equity in some more real baseline kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs, more baseline levels, and need our support.
So I'll take a crack at that, but I'm sure others will want to say a few things about it. I guess I actually see your comment linked to the prior comment in the following sense. When I hear people say, oh, unions, I understood why we needed them when we had child labor in the mines, but now what's the purpose of a union anymore now that we have a minimum wage and a maximum hours of work week? In the same breath they will say, oh, feminism. I understand why we needed it when women were relegated to the kitchen barefoot, but now, clearly times have changed and we don't need it anymore. And my hope, and of course, I'm not sure actually what evidence there is around this, but my hope is that if we can try to stack the pipeline and stack the leadership tables enough with people who understand that we're not there yet, that on all of those grounds, both at the boardroom level and all the way down that Maslow's hierarchy, I think the conversation starts to shift. But it has to begin with people who actually accept in their hearts that we're not done yet across every aspect of equity, right? And that is, it is hard to, it's hard to point to an example, at the highest levels where that's necessarily been the case, but I'm not sure that we've tried it.
I would say a couple of things. One is that it's so important not just to have the leadership, but to have evidence-based policy making, and I'm so heartened that it appears we are going to be returning to that. One thing that I found, we intervened in a case last year called Johnstone and Canada Border Services Agency, where Fiona Johnstone worked, she was unionized, she worked in an environment where her shift could start at any one of 6 times in a day, and it rotated every 6 weeks. There's absolutely no way to make childcare arrangements for that, and so she'd asked for a set shift. She said, I'll take the midnight shift, I'll do the weekend shift, I just need a set shift. And the employer said, no, having children is a choice. And if you want a set shift, you can go part-time and lose your benefits and your pension and everything else. So that's what she did and brought a human rights complaint successfully in the end. But and in the end, yeah, one, it was sex discrimination, although it was argued as family status discrimination, we said it's sex discrimination. Women are still doing the majority of the caregiving, whether it's elder care or child care or whatever. But what was interesting to me is that the first thing that happened at the hearing, before any of the parties made their submissions, and we were going to be on in the afternoon, the government lawyer stood up and objected to our factum because we had relied on Statistics Canada data that showed that women are predominantly the caregivers in this country. And the Harper government, when it got rid of the long-form census and put in the voluntary household survey, took out all the questions that gathered data about women being predominant caregivers. So not only did they not want us to be able to introduce the old data because there wasn't a recent census to rely on, they also wanted to prevent the data from being made in the first place, right? Like, it's Machiavellian. But we need to have evidence so that people will understand that these inequalities persist, because a lot of people won't believe it unless they see the numbers on the page. And then the second thing that I want to say, aside from that, is that it's incumbent upon us women that do have privilege to ensure that when we're making an argument, we should be looking around the room and going, is there an Indigenous woman here who could make this argument? who should be heard at the table? Is there a racialized woman whose voice needs to be heard and isn't being heard because she's not been invited or she can't access this room or whatever? It's incumbent upon us to make sure that those spaces are opened so that we're not the only people making these arguments, and that there are opportunities for those voices to be heard so that more people get engaged. Because again, if you don't see yourself on the screen or in the room, you're not going to want to get there yourself. So, I mean, there's a bunch of things that have to happen, but they all need to be pushed forward. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. And I think Jennifer now is going to, no, sorry, Paula is going to come back up. Stay.
So thank you very much, Jennifer, Kim, Amanda, Mary Lou, Danielle. Weren't they wonderful?